Symmetry is often used as a general term for beautiful proportion or balance. However, in this lesson, I will use symmetry in a more strict mathematical sense. An object has symmetry with respect to some action if after being transformed by that action, the object appears unchanged. Let me make that more clear with some examples. You're probably most familiar with bilateral symmetry. If you place a mirror down the center line of this beetle, which is shown as a red dashed line, the reflection of the left half in that mirror looks the same as the right half. And our body, like many animals, has bilateral symmetry because it's most efficient for moving in a forward direction. Organisms that move in multiple directions or that don't move at all have developed different body symmetries, such as this coral polyp, which has radial symmetry. Radial symmetry appears in many doilies. Apologies, this is a doily in the doily-free zone, but it's a good example. This bobbin lace roundel has mirror symmetry along 3 different lines. And if I place a hinged mirror so that the hinge is at the center of the pattern and the mirrors lie along any of these pairs of lines, the mirrors will complete the pattern. You can see one copy of the pattern, it's on the paper of the book. And we have 2 mirrors, and they would expect that each mirror has a copy of the pattern, but that only gives 3 copies. And when we look into the mirrors, we can see 6 copies. Almost magically, the other 3 copies come from reflections of reflections. Frieze patterns, named after the architectural decorations, are patterns that repeat in a line at a regular interval in space. The meander pattern pictured here is one of the oldest architectural frieze patterns and is a symbolic representation of waves. This is interesting because we can also think about periodic patterns as repetition in time, such as the rising of the sun, the rhythm of music, or the waves of sound or water. While reflection in a mirror is often thought of as looking back into the past, and we even use this word reflection to mean thinking about the past, periodic repetition is not about the past. It's about a continuity that extends into the future. It's about being able to predict what comes next. There are 7 different ways you can create a frieze pattern, and the field of mathematics and crystallography have developed naming conventions to label them. However, these labels are a bit cryptic and difficult to remember, even for chemists and mathematicians. John Conway, a mathematician, provided a much simpler and more physical naming convention using the motions we can make with our feet. His names are just as complete and rich as the more academic terms, but they also give an intuitive sense about what is going on. So that is what I will use here. So imagine painting your left foot with white paint and hopping in a line on that foot. Each time your foot lands, it makes an imprint, which is a copy of the base pattern. And if you hop at a steady rhythm, which is not that easy, your footprints will create a periodic pattern. Now, I mentioned that periodicity has long been associated with the rolling of waves. If you look at this Point de Gaze rose border, you can see the stylized leaves roll along in a wave-like pattern that reminds me very much of Hokusai's painting, The Wave. Here at the bottom, I have shown one copy of the basic pattern, which is equivalent to just one footprint. Notice that this base pattern has no additional symmetry, meaning you can't rotate around a point or reflect it in a mirror without changing what you see in just this one copy. So we say the base pattern is asymmetric or without symmetry. The next pattern, which is a step, is represented by walking in a line. Your right foot is a mirror reflection of your left foot, as a byproduct of our bilateral symmetry. Similarly, in this pattern, at each step the pattern is reflected in a horizontal mirror. But notice that the reflected copy is not directly below the original. It's not like you can place a mirror down the length of the edging and see a reflection of the bottom from the top. Instead, the reflected copies are slightly offset from one another, just as our footsteps are slightly offset when they land. This type of symmetry is also called glide reflection. So here, you can imagine this is one footprint, and if I reflect it in a mirror that goes this direction, I get this reflection of the footprint. And if I walk along, I get them left and right and left and right. Now, if we want the bottom to be a reflection of the top, we need to jump. We need to land with both feet at the same time, as shown here. Notice here now we have the bottom is a reflection of the top. Just as we have in these edgings, the bottom is a reflection of the top. As a side note, this kind of symmetry does not appear very often in needle and bobbin lace. It's much more common in knitted insertions. Another way to move is to go in a sideways direction. So we're landing with both feet, but instead of going forward, we go sideways. And this is what John Conway called a sidle. Here we also have mirror reflections, but the mirror is not along the length of the lace. Instead, it's perpendicular to it. So we can imagine there's a mirror reflection between the left foot and the right foot. There's also a mirror reflection between the pairs of feet. So in here between this landing of the feet and this landing of the feet, there's a mirror. And the mirror goes across the lace, not down the length of the lace. And notice that just as we had two different mirror reflections in the footprints, we also have two in the lace. So here is one, and here is another. And they're very different. They look kind of similar, but if you look at the details of them, they're different. This kind of sidle symmetry is very common in deeply indented lace edgings, such as the Van Dyck collars, which were popular in the 17th century. We've now exhausted the simple movements we can do with our feet, so let's add a spin. In the dizzy hop, you must rotate 180 degrees while in midair, all the time hopping on just one foot. And there we get rotation symmetry. So if we imagine a point between the big toes of these two feet, and we spin the pattern around that point, we'll get a copy, we'll repeat the pattern. Similarly, we could imagine a point between the heels of the feet, and if we spin the pattern 180 degrees around that point, again, we'll get the same pattern resulting. And here in our little insertion, we can see, imagine this is one foot. As we spin it around, we get this pattern, so we get the other half of the S. And if we spin around this point, we get back to our original position of the foot. So there are two positions for spinning in here as well. One is between the two halves of the S, and the other is between two copies of the S. There's also a dizzy jump. Notice now that the pattern has a mirror down the length of the edging. So we can imagine this mirror going between pairs of feet. And there's also a mirror perpendicular to the length of the edging. So we have a mirror that goes between sets of feet. And notice here we have two different perpendicular reflections, one between the toes and one between the heels. And we can see that in our edging here as well. So there's a mirror that goes down the length of this edging, and then there's another one that goes across the edging, one here, and another different one here. And to complete the set, we need to spin around in midair while doing a sidle. Here we still have the mirror between the pairs of feet, but there's no mirror going down the length. Instead, what we have is a rotation. So if you imagine a point between the pinky toes of the feet, we can rotate the pattern 180 degrees around that point, and it will look the same. And similarly, there's another point here between the copies of the white feet that we can rotate around the pinky toes, and it'll look the same. Notice now we have this mirror reflection. So we have sort of this S shape that's very similar to what we saw with the dizzy hop, but it's slightly different because we've introduced a reflection. So just going back to that dizzy hop, we're always rotating down the length of it. This was a rotation and this was a rotation. Whereas now with the dizzy sidle, we get these rotations, but then we also get these points in our lace. You can see them here in the edging, here and here. We have mirror reflections as well. So these 7 frieze patterns cover all the possibilities for symmetry in a line, which are also called symmetry in one dimension because you're only moving in one direction. Now let us look at symmetry in 2 dimensions, which are also called wallpaper patterns. So if you've ever hung wallpaper, you will recall that it comes in rolls and the pattern repeats along the length of the roll. But when you want to cover the whole wall, you need to take strips of the wallpaper and match them up. And aligning that seam, which is what gives us repetition in the second sideways direction, is often the hardest part. The wallpaper analogy gives us insight into how we can easily adapt an insertion or edging pattern to create a 2D pattern by combining the strips. We combine the strips in a variety of ways to give similar but slightly different appearances. So let's take this example of a buck's point insertion from Pamela Nottingham's book. And let's just ignore the foot sides on the top and the bottom. We can take one strip and then just keep repeating that strip over and over, just like putting wallpaper on the wall. And we get this design. And notice here in our column, we have these cloverleaf patterns all facing in the upright position. And in the second column, they're facing in the down position. Up and then down. We could also take this pattern, and now we can imagine we have this lace edging. We could just flip it over. So this isn't something we can do with wallpaper because wallpaper is only printed on one side, but lace has a pattern on the front and the back, and so we could just take our edging and flip it over. So here's one copy of the lace edging, and here it's just been flipped over. Now flipping over is exactly the same as putting a mirror at the bottom here of the lace along the length of the lace and reflecting it in the mirror. So we can see this clover leaf has been reflected to produce this clover leaf. And then we can keep doing that for row after row, just doing these reflections. Now notice that in the first column, we have the upright clover and the upside down clover. Upright, upside down. Another thing we could do is take our original strip, and this time we're going to flip it over, but we're going to flip it over along the length of it, so the long ways. And this is the same as placing a mirror here perpendicular to the lace and reflecting in the perpendicular mirror. So we get our original strip and our flipped over strip, original and flipped over. And notice here again, we are going to have upright, upside down, upright, upside down. But now take a look at the stems. This one's pointing right, this one's left, right, left. In the previous example where we flipped the lace over, they were all pointing in the right direction, to the right. So it's slightly different. And you can notice it most if you look at, say, the holes or the flow of the stems in the pattern, that they look significantly different. And a third thing we can do is we can take our lace edging and just rotate it 180 degrees. So here's our original and a rotation by 180 degrees, original and rotation. Here you can see that all of the clover leaves in the first column are upright, but their stems are facing opposite directions. So this points to the right and the left, and then the right and the left, unlike the original, where they all pointed to the right. And just like we did with our making grounds from our template, you can also indent the rows. So here are two different variations with indented rows. There are actually 9 different ways we can arrange linear frieze patterns that we discussed earlier. So if you look closely, you will see that the patterns have repetitions of these linear ideas. So here, for example, this is hopping on one foot, but now we've got 5 people all hopping on one foot in sync. Or here we can see the person is walking, but now we have multiple people in a row all walking in sync. So these could be like soldiers marching. And here we have people walking. These two are walking in the forward direction, and other people are walking in the opposite direction. So we could think of this as more like a musical parade where you have marching band or something, where they're marching, columns of people are marching through each other. And you can see the same thing happening in these other patterns. There's jumping and there's sidle patterns going on in all of these. They're just combinations of them. There are an additional 8 wallpaper arrangements that are a little more complex. Instead of line dancing, they're more like square dancing. So these ones on the left here have rotations, but instead of just 180-degree rotations, they also have other rotations. So this one has 60-degree rotations. This one has 120-degree rotations, and this one has 90-degree rotations. The column in the middle shows reflections, and in addition to the vertical and horizontal, they have mirrors that go on diagonals. And this last column shows combinations of reflections and rotations. If you're interested in the mathematics behind these symmetries that I've shown here, I recommend John Conway's book, The Symmetries of Things. He uses metaphors and analogies, such as these dance steps that I presented, to describe complex ideas in simple ways. For lace grounds, we're going to work with the 9 line dancing patterns that I showed you. The square dancing patterns are also possible, but they require more advanced techniques, which I will save for a future workshop. Now, drawing and recognizing the foot symbol can be a bit of a challenge in practice. So instead, I'm going to use a simple, easily recognizable symbol, which is the letter B. And notice that if we take the letter B and we reflect it in a vertical mirror, we get the letter D. If we reflect it in a horizontal mirror, we get the letter P. And if we rotate it 180 degrees, we get the letter Q. And I've used this coloring convention, so B and Q are related by being 180 degrees from each other. And D and P are also related by spinning around 180 degrees. So the blue and the white are mirror reflections of each other, and ones of the same color are rotations of each other. And here are the 9 patterns arranged in columns and rows, like the spreadsheet layout that we talked about in lesson 3. We can also indent rows and indent columns as we did in lesson 3. Then there are just 5 possible arrangements, 5 for the rows and 5 different ones for the columns. So not the full 9, but there are also interesting possibilities here. Okay, so that's the background on symmetry. So now let's see what that looks like for our grounds. In your handouts, you'll find a little cheat sheet like this, showing all the different BDPQ arrangements for the pattern. Now in lesson 3, we already looked at this one. So this is the spreadsheet, and all of the copies are just facing the same direction. We also looked at this one with the indenting of the rows, and this one where we indented the columns. In the rest of the patterns, you'll see that there's more than one letter. Sometimes there's all 4 of the letters, and sometimes there's just 2 of the letters. I'm going to show you how to make one of the patterns using this cheat sheet, and to do that, I'm going to have a look at this pattern first. Okay, it uses all the different letters, and so let's see what that looks like. I started up by cleaning the template up a little bit. So I had all my lines in pencil, and I've traced the pins in marker and gone over the pairs in marker. I've also written this little letter B up here at the top so that I know that this is my B orientation. I also turned the template upside down and held this up to a window and traced the back. So I traced the pair lines on the back and made sure that the pins were all visible. And notice now that my letter B has become a D. So to get to this D pattern, I just need to turn the template upside down. I've also reinforced the corners with tape because I'm going to be flipping this pattern around from time to time. So I want to make sure that my tape doesn't tear the template. The other thing to notice is here I have the letter B, and if I just rotate my pattern 180 degrees, I get the letter Q. Notice in the cheat sheet, the letter B and the letter Q are both in white, meaning they appear on the same side of the template paper. If I turn the template over, I get the letter P. And if I rotate that 180 degrees, I get the letter D. So notice that D and P are always in blue, meaning they're on the same side of the template paper. Okay, so the first thing we want to do to draw this pattern is trace the pattern in the D orientation. So the first row starts with a D. So here's my D orientation, and let me just trace that. So I've traced the pins and the pair lines, and now I'm just going to put the letter D in pencil in one of the holes so that I can remember how I created this in case I get interrupted and have to come back. So the next thing in our template, in our little pattern here, is the letter B. In order to get to the letter B, I have to turn the paper over. Now I'll take the 3 pins that are on the right side of my tracing and line them up with the 3 pins that are on the left of my template. And trace. Here I notice that I already have a line, but the template shows the curve of a line in the background, so I'll make that a double pair. And I'll mark this one with the letter B. I can continue this row marking DB, DB all as wide as I want this pattern to be. So I'm not going to do that right now, but you can easily follow this pattern that I've shown you and do that yourself. Now I'm coming down to the second row, and it starts with the letter Q. So I'm going to find Q in my template. So if I just rotate the template around, I find my letter Q and fix it in place. Now I'm going to take the 2 pins that are at the top of the template and line them up with the 2 pins that are at the very bottom of my tracing. And now I trace this copy. And I mark it with a Q. Okay, so the rest of the row goes Q, P, Q, P, Q, P. So next I'll do a P. And the P is a mirror reflection of the Q. So I'll turn my paper over. Okay, here's my letter P. And trace. and mark this with a P. And I can continue repeating QP, QP as wide as I want the pattern to go. Now going down to the third row, it's very similar to the first row, but instead of starting with a D, it starts with a B. So I need to find that B orientation. So I have to flip my paper over and rotate it to find my D, B. So here is B. And again, I'm just going to align the 2 pins that are on the top of the template with the 2 pins that are at the very left at the bottom of my tracing. And I will mark this with the letter B. This row goes B, D, B, D, so the next will be a D. D is a mirror reflection of B, so I turn the paper over. And just line the right side of the traced B with the left side of the D template. And trace. And mark it with a D. Okay, that brings us to the last line of this pattern, which starts with the letter P. So find the letter P. And notice that the P and the D are the same color, so they're on the same side of the paper. I just finished a D, so I should just have to rotate the paper to get the letter P. Rotate the paper and there it is. And again, lining the left 2 pins on the template and the tracing. So the 2 pins at the far left on the bottom of the tracing line up with the 2 pins at the top of the template. Take your time with this step because accuracy for the pins is important. All right, and trace. The next is the letter Q, and Q is a mirror reflection of P, so I have to turn the paper over. Now I'm aligning the left side of the tracing with the right side of the template. Sorry, the right side of the tracing with the left side of the template. All right, If the area I want to fill is even longer than this, what I would do after this row of PQ is to come back here to the first row and start again with DB. I traced a few more columns of this pattern just so we can see a bigger picture of it, and I've also marked this tracing with the template so I can come back to it and remember how I made it. Now I'd like to look at a little bit of the symmetry that's going on in here. So first let's notice that there's this star shape. It has a square at the center, and then the corners are very much like a rose ground with these 4 diamonds around it. But then it has these points that are different. So it's like a star instead of a rose ground pattern. Let's see where that star came from. So it's actually this little part of our template, and that crossing has been reflected in a vertical mirror to give this crossing, and then if we imagine a horizontal mirror here, those 2 crossings are reflected down to create these 2 crossings. And if we look back at the pattern we were following, we can see that here as well. So there's a mirror, a vertical mirror here reflecting the D into the B, and then we have a horizontal mirror here reflecting the D down to the Q and the B down to the P. So our pattern predicted that kind of shape. We can also see these 2 holes in our template, and we find them here in our pattern here, and those 2 holes are reflected to create these 2 holes, and those 4 holes are reflected down to create these 4 holes. And in total, we're getting this pattern that looks like a ring of petals. So there are 12 holes around in a ring with a star in the center. So it's kind of like a flower with its center. We can also see that there's one flower here, and then there is another flower here, and they kind of touch or overlap a little bit, and that continues down the row. So we have a row of flowers. And up here we also have a row of flowers. So here's 1 center, 2, 3. So along here we have a row of flowers. But notice that the center of this flower is here, and the center of the next flower here in this row is offset a little bit. So it goes in a sort of a zigzag pattern between the centers of the flowers. And we can see that here as well in our template that we were in our cheat sheet. We have this little pattern here which made 1 flower, and then down here offset is the same arrangement of letters. So the DBQP, down here we have another DBQP, and we notice it's not directly underneath, it's offset a little bit. If we wanted it directly underneath, we would use this pattern instead. So here the DBQP and this DBQP are in the same column. And if you look around, you'll see other aspects of symmetry going on. So there's kind of a zigzag ribbon going through the flowers as well, between rows of flowers. I'd also like to show you a few comments about the other patterns in this cheat sheet. It's pretty straightforward. These ones are arranged like a spreadsheet. These ones you have indented rows, and these ones you have indented columns. The little thing to keep in mind of is for this particular pattern, when you're indenting columns, these 2 rows are actually at the same indentation. So there's a mirror reflection between the first row and the second row, so these 2 rows have to line up exactly. You don't start indenting until you get to the 3rd row, and the 3rd and 4th row line up exactly, and the 5th and 6th row line up exactly. So the indentation only happens for every 2nd row. Similarly, for this particular pattern, these 2 columns have to be lined up at the top because there is a mirror line here between the B and the D. So the indentation doesn't happen until you get to the 3rd and 4th column, and then another indentation for the 5th and 6th column. For the rest of these examples, the indentation happens at every column or every row. Okay, now it's your turn to try. As homework for this lesson, what I'd like you to do is take some of your templates, clean them up, mark them with the letter B, trace the back side, and then try some of these different arrangements. Try several and see what happens when you use the same template in different arrangements. Maybe some of them appeal to you, maybe some of them don't. Also, you can be creative and try different letter combinations instead of the ones that appear here and see what happens. You can also create random combinations. You don't have to stick to a periodic pattern like I've shown here. You can mix it up however you like. The important part is to experiment, be creative, and have fun. So I hope you enjoy.